Welcome to accountability. Today we're going to be chatting a bit about why accountability is important, talk about reflection. I'm Leslie Blood. My research is in behavior modeling, modification, and prediction. And I've spent the last 10 years working with students, faculty, and staff on accountability, and I'm excited to share some information with you guys today. So today we'll do an introduction to accountability. We'll talk about 4 main responses. We'll also discuss strategies. We'll talk a little bit about specific tools you might want to implement, and we'll also chat a bit about how to reflect in order to improve accountability, and also how reflection does truly improve your overall resiliency. So the learning outcomes for today is that you'll be able to examine some of your responses and figure out appropriate accountability strategies based on how you respond to expectations. You'll be able to use your reflections to maybe improve your accountability style and also discover some interesting things about yourselves, maybe how you're behaving when you're asking yourself to do something versus if someone else is asking you to do something. We will also chat a little bit about habits that will support accountability, which of course the main one's going to be reflection for today. So lots of fun stuff on deck. Accountability. Why is it so hard for us to do the things we say we want to do, even though we actually want to do them? And an accountability question to ask yourselves is, how do we respond when other people are asking us to do things? Are you able to meet deadlines, for example? Are you much of a planner? Do you tend to struggle with boundaries? Are you overscheduling? Are you struggling with time management, time organization? Are you suffering from decision-making fatigue? Do you know what you actually want to prioritize? And are you prioritizing those things? If you are interested in building a growth mindset, are you doing that appropriately? If your plans go sideways, do you have contingency plans? And that's a really interesting one, because your contingency plan can't really feel like a plan B or a lesser plan. It needs to still feel just as good as plan A. And then finally, of course, we want you to be able to assess your main response to accountability. No one is perfectly one thing when it comes to responding to accountability. So you may respond differently in different situations. So we'll chat a little bit about all those things as well. And you know how to be flexible. This is especially important when we talk about growth. And it's also really important when we're talking about being able to pivot, especially if plans change. I, many years ago, read a book Gretchen Rubin wrote called The 4 Tendencies. And this was, oh my gosh, maybe back in 2010, 2012, something like that. And it really did change a lot of things for me, mainly the way I parented and the way that I worked with students. So the main 4 tendencies that Gretchen Rubin discovered and she developed are, well, I can go through them. I'll go through them in order too, by popularity. So most people tend to be obligers. And so obligers respond readily to external accountability, tend to struggle a bit more with internal accountability. Most of my students are questioners, and because I work in academia, that's probably not all that uncommon. So questioners tend to respond very readily to expectations if and only if they trust the person who's asking them to do the things, or they believe the thing they're asking of themselves is the right thing to do. So you really have to drill down on that why. They have to believe in the thing to do the thing. And then we have the rebel tendency, and rebels tend to resist both internal and external expectations. So what this means is that if a rebel, for example, tends to make a plan or want to, agree to something in advance in the moment, they may want to change their minds. The other thing is if you tell somebody who tends to resist external expectations to do something, even if they were planning to do it, chances are they're not going to want to do it anymore. And then finally, we have upholders. And since we're going to be chatting today, I should let you know that that's what I am. I respond, and upholders respond readily to both internal and external expectations. The drawback for me, for most of us, is that we're not always the most flexible thinkers. So those are the 4 main tendencies. Obligers benefit from external accountability structures. So what does that mean? So in short, if you are an obliger and let's say that you want to accomplish a thing. One of the best ways that you can do that is to loop somebody else in. So if an obliger wants to start going to the gym, let's say, or an obliger wants to finish writing a dissertation, having a partner, somebody who's going to meet them there, that will keep them accountable. I really think that there's a lot about the obliger tendency that's really interesting because it's one of the most simple fixes, that external accountability part, but it can be really challenging to figure out, exactly where some of that obliging is coming from. The other really big thing for obligers, and we'll talk about, like that history where the obliging is coming from in just a sec, but one of the most important things there too is your ability to set and uphold boundaries. So for example, there tends to be like two main kinds of obliging. Obliging that's done out of duty, guilt, responsibility, versus obliging that's done because they truly believe they can handle all the things all the time. And then of course, who's getting pushed out of the obliger's schedule? They are, because they will prioritize other people's needs above their own. And maybe on paper that sounds super great if you're in a relationship with an obliger, but it's not so great for the obligers themselves. So learning how to set and uphold boundaries, big thing for obligers. The other thing too that obligers need to be mindful of is burnout, especially if you're an obliger who says yes, yes, yes to all of the things because you truly believe you can accomplish them all. It's really common that sometimes you'll feel really overwhelmed, you'll need a long break. So we want to sort of get in before that overwhelm hits. We don't want an obliger to get really stressed out and check out. It tends to take a little bit for somebody to get back on track when that happens. And then finally, what we really want obligers to do during reflection is to figure out in which circumstances they do tend to prioritize other people's needs over their own and be able to answer why. Reflection is also a really nice tool for obligers when they're trying to set different types of boundaries. So for example, what boundaries are working? What boundaries are you struggling with? Sometimes obligers will find that their personal and professional obliging looks quite a bit different. So all of that can be really useful information to have. Next up, we're going to talk about questioners. So, oh boy, questioners are probably my most challenging tendency to work with. I adore them. My older son is a questioner as well. And naturally, there's a lot of critical thinking going on with questioning. Now, just like obligers tend to have two main different forms of obliging, I have found that questioners tends to work the same way for questioners as well. And it comes down to trust, right? So like a lot of people will question authority because of trust. And sometimes when we're looking at, on the flip side, the questioning just straight up comes from curiosity. So whether you are a questioner who's skeptical or a questioner who's incredibly curious, chances are you're going to experiencing some of the following. Number one is decision-making fatigue. Number two is inability to stick with the plan that you made, even though you believed in the plan at the time. You're also going to have trouble making commitments. And when I say that, I mean that if there are a lot of different options that you're playing around with, it's really hard to choose the one. You're a questioner if you have read every single review on Amazon for an item prior to purchasing it, and then you don't end up purchasing it anyway. So it's just constantly needing more and more information to feel like you can make the right decision. And then the other thing for questioners, one of the things we'll talk about today when we're discussing reflection, in reflection, questioners can start to tease out exactly what it is that they want to prioritize and work on just committing to those things. So for example, if you have, a bunch of goals, or if you have, let's say, let's say you have a big project coming up, or you have a big assignment due, being able to make a plan and stick with a plan is really critical. And reflection helps questioners get to the point where there's buy-in, like they believe that the plan is the right thing to do. And that's going to be a really critical piece of reflection for questioners, because without that, it's going to be really hard for them to do anything that they commit to. Rebel tendencies. So I mentioned that my older son is a questioner, my little one is a rebel, and they're probably the most fun to work with because they're so unique and different. Rebels tend to resist both internal and external accountability, but there are a lot of different reasons for that. Number one is rebels have a very, very, very strong sense of identity. And so they tend to be motivated by the things that make them different. For example, if a rebel really wants to work on a project and is inspired to do it, they can work for 24 hours in a row and not feel exhausted or tired or anything. They may need a few days off afterwards, but when they're motivated, they can really go, go, go. Another thing that a lot of rebels will experience is feeling like they need to be able to have the freedom to choose. And today when we talk more about strategies, there's something called the illusion of freedom. So basically, even if you want to resist both internal and external expectations, the reality is that you're going to have to meet them in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's something you're asking of yourself, like, I set this doctor's appointment for myself and I need to go even though I'm not in the mood, versus, let's say professionally, your boss needs you to get something done and there's this deadline, and blowing off that expectation is not going to work. So you do need to figure out how to meet them, but the way that we approach it's going to be different. It's very much identity focused for my rebels. Last but not least, we have upholders. So I mentioned earlier that I'm an upholder, so upholders generally will readily meet both internal and external expectations with pretty much no questions asked. So by that I mean, if my boss tells me to do something and gives me a deadline, I say, okay, and I do it. I'm not going to try and negotiate the deadline. I'm not going to try and negotiate the project. Now, the internal part of that is that if I decide I'm doing something or if I want to do something, I don't need external accountability to do it. An example might be for an upholder, you wake up one day with a wild hair and you're like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write the next American novel. No one's going to need to come in and tell the upholder, oh, by the way, you're going to need to dedicate this much time a day. They're very, very disciplined when it comes to making a plan and setting a plan. Now, as far as one of the drawbacks, and when we talk about strategies today, one of the things we'll touch on is this idea of flexibility and contingency plans. Most upholders have a plan A and only a plan A. And the reality is, of course, that sometimes plan A just doesn't come around. And so then what do? Well, what we don't want to have happen is for upholders to feel like they're compromising too much because their internal trust is so important. So how do we create flexibility and still really focus on performance? All right, so let's go ahead and do our first activity. Now that we've talked about the different tendencies, I would like you guys to take a few minutes and think about what motivates you to meet expectations. So that means internal expectations, things you're asking of yourself, and external expectations, what other people are asking of you. So what motivates you to meet them? The follow-up question that I want you all to think about is what prevents you from meeting expectations? So for example, if I'm an upholder and I'm responding to this question, what motivates me to meet expectations is performance. I want to do the very best job that I can. If I say out loud I'm doing something, I'm doing it no matter what. So it's that commitment piece. What prevents me from meeting them will oftentimes come down to my inability to be flexible if plans do change, because plans do change, and then I tend to really struggle on the other side. So if everyone will take a few moments to think about what motivates you to meet them, what challenges you and prevents you from meeting them, and think about performance, right? So like, that's me wanting to do a good job. Think about perfectionism, because sometimes there's a lot of avoidance when it comes to expectations. So you might be failing to meet expectations because you're holding yourself to an impossible standard. Responsibility. So this kind of ties back to my obligers for sure. Are you meeting expectations because you feel a responsibility to these people? For the other tendencies, maybe there's like a hiccup around the responsibility pieces. Maybe you don't feel like you need to be responsible to other people. Trust. Do you meet expectations because you trust yourself implicitly? Are you meeting external expectations because you trust the person that's asking you? Or are you struggling because of the trust issue? And last but not least, control. Well, how tight are those control mechanisms? What is your style of commitment like? If the words come out of your mouth that you're doing something, are you going to do it? So let's just take a few minutes, reflect, and then we will be back in just a minute.